We're sort of in a beat-em-up renaissance right now, at least in terms of reboots for classic franchises. Streets of Rage 4, River City Girls, and TMNT Shredder's Revenge all coming out in the past few years has definitely restored my interest in the genre. Since Shredder's Revenge recently got added to Game Pass, I thought I'd boot it up and work through a few levels every now and then between other games that I'm playing. However, 3 hours later I had fully beaten the main story mode of the game, feeling really fulfilled with my experience. These games are just the perfect little bite-sized morsels of arcade action. And so, with all these revivals, it made me really want to see something similar from Capcom. Old Capsule Computers has some of the best games in the genre. When I think of arcade games, I think of beat-em-ups, and when I think of beat-em-ups, I'm usually thinking of Capcom's. They released a bundle of a few titles back in 2018, but other than that, Capcom doesn't really seem interested in joining the wave of retro beat-em-up revivals. However, the legacy of the mini beat-em-ups that the company released over their golden age is nothing to scoff at, and after playing a few at a shitty bootleg arcade machine at a local bar, I decided that I wanted to play them all, from the first to the last, and so begins my Capcom beat-em-up retrospective. In 1987, Capcom released Street Fighter into the arcades. The game would go on to be the 5th highest earning arcade game in Japan that year, and marked the beginning of one of Capcom's most prolific franchises in the genre of fighting games as a whole. Capcom obviously wanted to follow up on this success, and they put this task on the dev team who had just finished the shooter Forgotten Worlds. Forgotten Worlds was the first game that Capcom developed for the CPS-1, the first in a line of modular arcade boards. The CPS consisted essentially of a core motherboard and detachable daughter boards that contained data for individual games. This meant that arcade owners could switch out games and cabinets without switching out the entire board. It also ended up being cheaper for Capcom to manufacture. Developers like Akira Nishitani and Akira Yasuda, who worked on Forgotten Worlds, became familiar with the system over the course of that game's development and hoped to make a sequel to Street Fighter using the board. During this time, production of Nintendo's Famicom left a shortage of ROM chips in its wake. This led the team working on what was then called Street Fighter 89 to have to pivot to something less memory-intensive. This pivot led to Yasuda drafting up an 89-page design document for what would eventually become Final Fight. Final Fight was Capcom's first real foray into side-scrolling beat-em-ups. Starting with Technos' Double Dragon and Kunio-kun series, the genre had been gaining popularity among coin-up connoisseurs, especially in the United States. However, I don't think anything quite codified the genre like Final Fight did. It propelled Capcom into the pantheon of beat-em-up developers and established a lot of what the company had to offer to the genre going forward. According to Yasuda, in an interview with Capcom for the game's release in the Capcom Beat-em-up collection, a lot of the game design was informed by the visual design. Quote, I could see that we'd be getting more memory for graphics in the future, so I wondered if there wasn't a more efficient way of doing things. So, I adopted the style of getting all the character designs out, and then actually going into production for Final Fight. Looking at production where the character designs are made to a certain extent at the beginning, it's a method that's close to that of anime, unquote. Final Fight was so distinctive because its characters, player and enemy alike, took up so much of the screen. Compare even just a screenshot of Final Fight to something like Double Dragon and you can see what I mean. Attention to detail was a focus of this game, and the CPS had the ability to deliver said detail. An infamous example is how the handles swing on the subway, or the lights flickering, or the crowd during the boss fight with Sodom reacting to the player putting him on his ass. This game has a real polished shine that sets it apart from a lot of its contemporaries. Some of these stages like the Bay Area and Uptown have some great looking backgrounds, and the way they change throughout the stage is great too. Uptown quickly moves on from the city streets and into a lavish skyscraper, letting the player know that they've come far from the trashy alleyways of the first stage. An elevator then takes you up to an open garden area garnished with 2 giant pools and palm trees. It really starts to feel like a non-Euclidean space at a certain point, but I can definitely look past that because it looks so beautiful. I had the SNES version of Final Fight growing up, but I could never get past the previously mentioned fight with Sodom. I felt a lot more capable playing the arcade version, but that could just be my age as well. All in all, it holds up a lot better than many other arcade games from the time. I'm certainly not the best at these type of games, but they're kind of not hard to enjoy with infinite credits. The game centers around the kidnapping of a blonde-haired girl by the Mad Gear Gang, which is named after a previous Capcom racing game. The plot doesn't stray too far off from the likes of other beat-em-ups at the time. Beat the crime guys in every one of their palette swaps, save the girl, win the game. But you can start to see the graphic design up approach when you notice that the playable characters are not your run-of-the-mill, bandana-clad Bimmy and Jimmies. Instead, we have the former wrestler and current mayor Mike Hagar, who is the father of our damsel in distress, Cody, the broad-shouldered boyfriend of Mike's daughter Jessica, and his ninja buddy named Guy. According to Yasuda in that previously mentioned interview, Guy was included because so many other Capcom games had ninjas, and it started to feel like a staple to them. Guy is the fastest character, but also the weakest, with Hagar obviously rounding out the top of the spectrum and leaving Cody in the middle. I think Cody is the most fun to play as Guy can be a little fragile and Hagar a little stiff. As far as beat-em-up mechanics go, it's about as bog standard as you can get. There's really not a lot more to do than walk to the right, grab loot and weapons, and clobber whatever dumbass gets in your way. There's a beauty to the simplicity, but there's also a lot of clunkiness. There's no double tapping the stick to run, and so your fastest movement usually ends up being jump kicks or just walking. However, you can easily get yourself anti-aired to hell and back trying to jump kick every enemy you see like I did. The pickup variety is somewhat low, metal pipes, knives, and swords, and that's about it. Each character has a special spin move that can be done by pressing the attack and jump button at the same time. These use a little bit of health, but are really important to use when enemies are ganging up on you. If you've played any beat 'em up from this era, I'm sure this is all sounding very familiar. The game gets pretty frustrating towards the middle back half. There's this level with fire coming out of the floor, which is just such a pain to avoid. And a lot of the boss battles, too, just end up being more frustrating than fun, even with infinite continues. A lot are named after metal bands, though, and do a really good job of giving a lot of characterization to the Mad Gear Gang. No wonder they've got a hold of this city. They've got samurai, disgruntled veterans, and even the pigs amongst their ranks. A lot of these characters would work their way into the Street Fighter series over the years, with both games actually being set in the same universe. These have always been some of my favorite characters in the series, especially Hugo and Poison, and it makes a lot of sense because both franchises have been inherently linked to each other from the start. Eventually, our heroes come face to face with Belger, the leader of the Mad Gear Gang, and he rolls up with Hagar's daughter in his lap. After a good beating, Belger's wheelchair shatters, and after another good beating, so does his big window. After his plummeting demise, we see a cutscene where Guy kicks the shit out of Cody for being rude, and giving the silent treatment to Jessica. If my boyfriend rescued me from an evil gang and then refused to talk to me afterwards because there's more evil out there, I probably would be a little more frustrated than her. Final Fight ended up being a huge hit for Capcom. After releasing in December of '89, the game became the top-grossing arcade cabinet of the following year in both Japan and the States. In '91, the game still remained popular, only being outsold by the arcade phenomenon that was Street Fighter II. Now, remember how I said that Final Fight was Capcom's first real foray into the world of beat-em-ups? Well, a few months before Final Fight released, Capcom released a game known as Dynasty Wars in the West. The Japanese title, Tenchi Kurao, comes from the Hiroshi Motomiya manga adaptation of the Chinese novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms. The game is labeled as a beat-em-up usually, but the gameplay is a little different. It actually feels a lot like a 2D version of a Dynasty Warriors game, even though there doesn't seem to be any connection between the two beyond both being based on the same novel and having similar titles in the West. As far as I could find, there was no mutual developers or citable inspiration between the two series. The game is a lot more fun and fast-paced than I expected from screenshots. There's 4 playable characters, and the game doesn't let you swap them out if you die like Final Fight does, so I was on Liu Bei mode the whole playthrough. The main differences between them seem to be health and strength values, which are both stats that can be heightened through the game's leveling system. Having light RPG elements in a beat-em-up is something that Capcom will play with a lot more in the future, so it's interesting to see its roots right here. You got 3 buttons, a left attack, a right attack, and a power button that uses whatever tactic is currently available. I wasn't sure exactly how the currently equipped tactic changes, but I believe it just changes at certain parts of the stage. These usually include support fire from archers, or raining down boulders on enemies' heads, stuff like that. But one tactic actually summons an ally who will ride around the stage and attack whenever you do.
I am here to assist you.
Attacking in a direction will make you and your steed face that direction, and I really just enjoy making the horse walk backwards, especially up hills and stairs. It's just funny to me. Much like Final Fight, this game's presentation is really strong. There's often dialogue down in the bottom part of the screen, the amount of voice samples in this game is really impressive, and I love the little cutscene that plays whenever you finish a level.
You're going to get my head? Ha 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 ha! You make me laugh. Come to see me at Tongmengu. I have told General Li Jiu.
It can get a little overwhelming at times with so much stuff being on screen, though. They really throw a lot of enemies at you. I'm not just calling it a 2D Muso because of the aesthetic choices. See, your character can not only attack, but charge up to do more damage over a wider area. It's simple, but it forces you to not just button bash through it all, and it really gives you that sensation of tearing through a group of enemy foot soldiers that makes Muso games so satisfying. It's a really interesting take on the side-scrolling beat-em-up, even if it just feels like a barrage of sprites at times. I really like this river level where you're going from boat to boat, but when the fire comes in, it just becomes hard to process everything that's going on in front of you. The game just has a lot more charm and style than I expected from looking at it at first, and personally I think it has a better soundtrack than Final Fight. Both of these games came out in 1989, but the true golden age of Capcom beat-em-ups really begins in the 90s. So next time, I'll be covering Captain Commando, The King of Dragons, and Knights of the Round.